I'm really glad that you're here tonight. I'm Carl Swenson. I'm course mentor in diversity and inclusion. And we're going to talk tonight about competency 8, which is assessment practices. Before we get started, I'd please like to ask you all to register your attendance. The reason that we do that is because we do some internal research, and it helps us to know who's been here at these meetings and how you do when it's time to take the exam. By the way, the research does show that folks who attend our webinars and our cohorts pass the exam about 90% of the time first try. So it's a good thing to do. Glad you're here. So little bit of a explanation of our virtual classroom here. Obviously you found the chat box, which is just to my left. And directly below me, all the way down in the file share pod, you'll find a copy of the PowerPoint that I'm using. It's called Assessment Practices 5-16. If you want to download it, it's a very simple process to do. You just simply put your cursor on it and click. A box will open up that says that you can download to your own computer. So this is how you get the PowerPoint, and then you don't have to take copious notes. So, Donna, we're going to get you to where you need to be. Yes, we will. Okay, so let's get started here. Let's get moving into what we want to talk about. First, I have to get my little green arrow out because I'm going to need it during the night. And then I'm going to hide the title bar. There we go. And now, here we go. So some of the things that we're going to talk about tonight are the different assessments that we have, different assessments that we use. But we want to start with the functional behavior assessment because it's used a lot. It's used an awful lot. It's the beginning step for a behavior intervention plan. And it's a common practice in special education. So what happens with a functional behavior assessment? If you've been through the Iris Center module on FBAs, then you're probably familiar with these folks, these students, Dajae, Dawson, and Cheryl Ann, because they're used in that module as examples. So we're going to talk a little bit about what their behaviors are, how those behaviors come to happen, and then what we can do to change those behaviors. So we look here, and Dajae, she's a good worker. She works quickly. She works correctly. She turns in her worksheets to her teacher. And because she's done this good job, her teacher gives her extra time to play her computer games in class. Dawson is also a good student. He does his work quickly and correctly. He turns his worksheets in, and his teacher gives him more worksheets to complete. And then Cheryl Ann, she doesn't like worksheets. As a matter of fact, she doesn't plan on doing them. So a couple of minutes after she's gotten her worksheet, she makes some rude comment to the teacher, and the teacher sends her out of the room. So what's happened here? Well, we have to think about this in some terms, and those terms are these: antecedent, behavior, and consequence. What happens? And why does the behavior happen? What is the function of the behavior? Hence the name functional behavior assessment. So we have to find out what the function of that behavior is. It's caused by something that takes place in the classroom. And that something is the antecedent, or as I like to refer to it, the trigger. It triggers the behavior. Behavior would never happen without a trigger, without an antecedent. Behavior would never happen. So how does this work out? Well, we go back to our 3 students here. You see that the antecedent in each case is teacher passes out worksheets, classwork. Teacher passes out classwork. That's the antecedent. The behaviors we talked about. Daget turns hers in after doing them quickly and correctly. Dawson turns his in after doing them quickly and correctly. And Cheryl Ann just makes a scene. So for every behavior, there's also a consequence. And you see the consequences listed there. Now, I have a feeling that Dawson's behavior may begin to change if the consequence remains the same. If Dawson keeps getting more worksheets, I think he's probably going to slow down a little bit. After all, why should he continue to do worksheets if he can change his behavior? So sometimes the consequences cause not such a good behavior. But most of the time what we have to do here is we have to look for the antecedent in order to figure out what's going on. Here's a good example. You're my teacher. We're in a history class. We're doing history today, and you've moved a little quicker than you thought you would, and we still have about 15 minutes left in the period. So you say to us, the students, you say, I'd like you to take your history book out and turn to page 156 and read until the end of the period. Oh, okay. Everybody starts pulling out books. I open them up to page 156. They start reading. But I hate to read because I'm not very good at it. I'm not very good at it at all. And so it just frustrates me to try to read. So I decide I'm not going to read. I slam my book shut and I throw it on the floor and tell you I'm not going to read that book. So that's a behavior. I bet there's going to be a consequence too. What are you going to do? You're probably going to send me out of the room or come to my desk and tell me to pick up the book. There's any number of consequences that may take place because of this behavior. So what can we do in this case? We have a problem. We have a behavior that's taken place, and we don't want to see that behavior again. So how do we stop the behavior from happening? What's the common link here? What's the thing that we have to do to stop that behavior of me slamming the book shut and throwing it on the floor when you tell me to take the book out and read it? What we have to do is we have to change the antecedent. If we can do something there, then there's no reason for the behavior to happen. It works that way. It's pretty cool. So what can we do? You got some ideas there? If you have an idea of what we can do, what kind of change can we make to the antecedent, to the trigger? What can we do? Jennifer wants to offer an alternate activity, okay? Something that doesn't have to do with reading. That's a possibility. What's Donna typing here? Let's see what she's got to say. Anybody else got some ideas? I know there's 9 of you out there now. That's great. That's great. We're doing pretty good tonight. So we should have at least a couple more ideas. What do we got here? Okay, it's coming up here. It's coming up. Here we go. So we have to do something. We can't just say, take your textbook out and read from page 156 on. Maybe they would like to draw a picture of a story instead. Okay, that's a possibility. But we still have the problem of getting the information out of the textbook. We're still going to have to do that. So we got to get that information out. Maybe less reading time. Okay. All right. Work in pairs. I like that idea. I like that idea. Maybe put a really good reader with me, and that good reader reads out loud. So while I'm looking at the words, I'm hearing them too. Two different means of representation. Oh, that's starting to sound like universal design for learning, isn't it? Yeah, so you're coming up with some great ideas here. So there's lots of things that we can do. Lots of things that we can do to change or remove the trigger. That's what's important. Because once we take that trigger away, there's no reason for the behaviors to happen. So there you go. Let them listen to the reading on a recorded message, okay? An audio book, you bet. Good ideas, every one of them. So here, as you're reading these reasons or purposes for an FBA, I think they're pretty obvious to you that we need to have a positive behavior instead of a negative behavior. So changing the antecedent or removing it will do that for us. It's pretty nifty. So what do? Well, we have something that we call the ABC observation report. ABC, antecedent, behavior, consequence. Someone's going to come into our room and observe our target student. We're going to find out what the behaviors are, what causes the behaviors, and what the consequences are. And on this ABC observation report, which is basically a piece of paper that's got 3 columns on it, one for antecedent, one for behavior, and one for consequence. When a behavior happens, the observer writes it down. But then the observer has to, in his or her mind, back up a little bit. What was it that caused that behavior? I'm going to have to go back in time for a little bit and figure that out. What caused the behavior to happen? And then we're also going to write down the consequence, because a lot of times when we look at this data, which is what we're gathering, when we look at this data, we begin to see that, yeah, the behavior is a problem, but maybe the consequences are a problem too. So we take a look at that. And if you've looked at the Iris Center Star Legacy module on the FBA, then you have seen how those consequences, there's some video clips in there that deal with just this subject. And you can see in those video clips that the teacher's response, the consequence, isn't always really good. So it not only benefits us in changing the antecedent, but it also benefits us in being able to reflect on our own style in the classroom. So there we are with the FBA, the Functional Behavior Assessment. I hope it makes a little more sense to you now than it did before, because it can be a pretty difficult concept. So, but any questions on FBA before we move on? I wait the obligatory 10 seconds to see if anybody's typing. Nobody is, so we'll move forward. Okay, so let's talk about accommodations as they deal with assessments. Now, if you've listened to me before in any of the cohorts or webinars that we do, you know that I talk about accommodations a lot, because I think they're an exceptionally important tool that teachers use to facilitate a child's learning. And there are some important things to talk about when we're discussing accommodations that are used with assessments. Now, one of the biggest things that we've got to do is to make sure that once we've applied accommodations to this exam or this test or assignment, that the scope, the rigor, the complexity of that accommodated exam is the same as it was before we applied the accommodations. For instance, some people might think that developing a multiple choice test that has only 3 possible answers instead of 4 would be an accommodation. But is it really an accommodation? 3 versus 4. Is one easier than the other? Got to think about that. Because if you think about the percentages, if you have four possible questions or 4 possible answers to a multiple choice question, and you're not really sure, you have a 25% chance of guessing it correctly. If there are only 3 possible answers, you have a 33% chance of guessing correctly. It's easier if there's only 3 possible answers than if there are 4. So yes, in fact, and we have, Don, we've changed the test. We've made it easier. So that would be a modification. So what we have to do is every time we think about this, about putting together an assessment, what we have to do is make sure that that rigor is still there. We don't want to reduce that. For instance, I send out a quiz every once in a while to folks who request it. One of the questions talks about an English language learner who's being assessed for his reading achievement. And we talk about what accommodations we might use in that particular case. And one of the accommodations is to give the kid more time. Another accommodation is to give the kid a bilingual dictionary. A third accommodation would be to have someone read the test to him. Now, what was the purpose in our test here? What was the purpose in our assessment? It was to assess his reading achievement. So would it be good to have someone read the test to him? No, it would not. That's just the wrong idea. What we need to do is come up with a different accommodation that maintains the complexity, the scope of the test. And in this case, I think it would be giving him extra time. That would tell us a lot more about the student's ability to read than the other 2. So we want to make sure that we always maintain that complexity. It's only fair to do that. Now here are some examples of how we might, or some of the examples of accommodations we might offer to students who are in a testing situation. And you can see that they're pretty standard. You know, I think probably what we do for the most part is give extra time as an accommodation, but there are others. Anytime we give extra time, I want you to consider too giving breaks, because it has to do with attention span. My attention span is about that long. It's about that long. You know, during this conversation tonight, I'll probably zone out and start doing something else because my attention span is that short. So if my attention span is 15 minutes long and you give me 30 minutes extra on the exam, then in essence, half of that's wasted because I'm going to lose interest in what's going on. So I have to have some sort of a brain break, even if it's just as stretch and move around a little bit and get back in my chair. Just get it that way so that I'm able to use all of my time. Yeah, scheduling during alert times. You're right. Yeah. Don't take a test at 11:30 at night after everybody else in the house is quiet because you're going to go to sleep. So not a good thing to do. You want to be alert when you're taking that test. Mm, yeah, I've tried to write papers late at night. And, all of a sudden I'm going along strong and then they don't make any sense at all. Yeah, because I'm done. Yep. So those are the kinds of things that we want to look at for accommodations. Just as long as we maintain that extent of rigor in the test. Now, one thing that I want to talk to you about in high-stakes testing, if you want to give accommodations, that's great. But in most states, when we're talking about high-stakes testing, most states require that the accommodations be part of the IEP. So if it's not in the IEP, it cannot be used in one of the high-stakes testing, like district testing or state testing or something like that. So you have to really make sure. Okay. Oh, Donna, you'll do okay. As long as you're not, as long as you didn't get up at 6:30 this morning. I mean, you should have had a fairly easy day. So I'm hoping you're making it at 10:30 tonight. Now, sometimes we do have to do modifications. We do. Sometimes we have to. But think about it. What does a modification do? It changes the curriculum. It usually about 98% of the time, a modification reduces the amount of workload that we expect from the student. It reduces the amount of learning that the student receives. Now, I said about 98% of the time because the other 2% of the time, when we modify curricula, we increase the workload. But that's for the gifted and talented kids. So if you think that most of the time we reduce the amount of work that we expect from the student, then what happens next year when the kid moves up a grade? I was his fourth grade teacher. He came to me reading at a second grade level. I let him continue all year without trying to improve that. I modified his curriculum. You're the fifth grade teacher. I'm about to hand him off to you. And if we're really lucky now, he might be reading at the third grade level. All I've done is just increase the difficulty that you're going to have in teaching him. So modifications do always, or not always, but most of the time, modifications reduce the amount of work that we expect from the student. Now, there are times when we have to. There really are. If we have someone who's reading significantly below grade level, I'm talking about 2 grade levels or more, then there have to be some modifications until such time as we can work on improving that student's reading ability. And the same with math. If we're significantly below, and I'm talking way below now, not just, hey, he didn't get the multiplication last week, so let's modify. No, that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about here is a student who's so far behind in math that we have to go back to the prerequisite skills, adding, subtracting, basic level stuff. Modifications apply only to those with an IEP. Shannon, modifications do. There is no law that says accommodations can only be used for students with disabilities. When I was teaching in a public school, I provided accommodations for all my students. If they needed an accommodation, I provided it. So, accommodations can be used with anyone who has a roadblock or an obstacle to his or her learning. use the accommodation to remove that, get it out of the way so that those kids can learn. But modifications have to be listed on the IEP. How do you handle those highly intelligent, underachieving students? Those who test well but don't do the work. Yeah, boy, that is such a great question, and one that's very difficult to answer, because with most kids, you got to find the spark. You just have to find the spark that's going to cause that kid to really get into what you're trying to teach. It doesn't happen all the time. It really doesn't. And there are kids who don't have to crack a book. They can sit down and they can take a test and they can do well. And trying to keep them engaged is really difficult. But you know what? I see that same thing happening here at WGU. I'll get a person who says, well, I really don't need to go through this course because I've been working in a school for 2 years or 4 years or 6 years, so I really don't need to go through this course. And my response to them is, here at WGU, that I'm not teaching you about special education. I'm teaching you about being a teacher. And the more you work at it, the better the teacher you're going to be. Some people listen to me, some don't. But when you think about that with the individual student, there has to be some way to get that spark in the kid, some way to get him engaged and involved. Because I really think that most of those who test well and don't do the work, I think for the most part they're males. Now, we're actually supposed to talk about assessments tonight, so I think we're going to. If you've taken a cruise through our textbook or through the course of study, you found that there's a ton of different standardized assessments that are mentioned somewhere in the textbook. And there are many of them that have specific uses. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about those, but before we do, we need to understand the difference between a norm referenced assessment and a criterion referenced assessment. Now, norm referenced assessments are those that we take, and when we do, we normally get a percentile for a grade. For instance, in school testing, we get readouts, printouts on our students, and it will say that in this particular subject, the student scored in the 52nd percentile, and in this particular subject, the student scored in the 75th percentile. Now, those are the result of a standardized norm-referenced assessment. What happens is that our student takes an assessment, it is graded, and then that grade is compared to the grades of everybody else who's ever taken that exam. And then that allows them to put them in those different percentages or those percentiles. And so that's what makes this test a little bit difficult. Now, if you're reading the slide, you're seeing a lot of things there that might sound to be a little strange, but the second bullet point there says that we have to have a rigid adherence to directions. In order to maintain the validity of a norm-referenced assessment, a standardized assessment, everybody who gives a test has to give it in exactly the same way. And that's why, for most of these, teachers don't give them. Instead, it's people who have been trained to do that. If I were giving a standardized assessment and I wanted my kids to do a little bit better, maybe I'd give them an extra 10 or 15 minutes to work on it. Well, that skews all of the other scores because the conditions aren't the same as for other people. So that rigid adherence is very important. And there's a lot of biases in one of these tests. You don't really think about it, but there are. For instance, let's say that we're testing a kid in the bayous of Louisiana, and we're testing another kid in southwestern Arizona, and a third kid in North Dakota, and maybe a fourth kid in Connecticut. All right, 4 kids, all taking the exam. Now, the exam is written, hold on just a second. Jason, the answer is yes. Yes. It's okay. I'll talk to you more about it later. Anyway, we have all these kids from all over the country taking this exam, and it's written by some guy, some white-haired old geezer that's sitting up in an ivory tower somewhere. Probably hasn't been in a school for a while, at least a public school. And he's using a language to write that test that we call cognitive and academic language. These kids, and we'll say that they're third graders, they don't know that language. As a matter of fact, each of those kids, North Dakota, Connecticut, Louisiana, and Arizona, they all use a different language. A little bit different for everybody. So they're going to have trouble understanding what the questions are in the first place. I did a lot of research in West Virginia, in the northern part of West Virginia, in Head Start programs. And I would use a test that involved a series of pictures. There were 4 pictures on a page. And I would say, show me whatever. And then the kid would point to the picture, the correct picture. It's called the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. And we're determining the vocabulary of 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. Now, in the part of West Virginia I was in, anything that had wheels and carried people was called a vehicle. It wasn't anything else. It was called a vehicle. So it could have been a school bus, could have been an ambulance, could have been a motorcycle, could have been a tractor, but it was a vehicle because it had wheels and it transported people. So that's a difference in language. It really is. Well, not all the hollers, but yeah, some of them I was, yeah. But, you know, and yeah, I at one time dated a young lady from Virginia, and she'd tell me to cut on the lights or cut off the lights. And yeah, to me, that didn't make any sense. All she wanted me to do was either flip the switch up or down, but I didn't understand it because it was a different language. So that's one of the biases that we have, pop and soda. There you go. Yep, yep. Hat and cap. Okay, very good. You're seeing the point. You got it. You got it. So that's a bias. And other biases we don't think about. One of them was earlier. We talked about taking tests during alert times. Don't give a kid a test right after lunch. That doesn't work. If a kid is more alert in the morning, give him the test in the morning. Did the kid have breakfast before he came to school? Is he fully fed? Were his parents fighting last night and kept him awake all night? Those are all biases that these standardized assessments have. We can't control any of them, but they're biases. So we have to watch out for that. And they are very weak in giving us instructional direction. They don't tell us a lot about what the kid still needs to learn. So norm reference tests are good for some things, but not for everything. So we also have the criterion referenced assessment. It says based, but it should be referenced, criterion referenced assessment. Now these are better because they show us what students can do, because we're not comparing the student to anybody. We're just looking at what that student can master. For instance, the criterion or the task might be this. I have a math worksheet that's got 25 problems on it. They're two-digit addition problems. So I'm adding one two-digit number to another two-digit number. There's 25 of them on the sheet. I want the kid to complete the worksheet in 5 minutes with 80% accuracy. That's the criterion. That's the task. Complete this worksheet of 25 problems within 5 minutes with 80% accuracy. Now, what I'm finding out is, can the kid master that task? That's what the criterion referenced assessment shows me. It also shows me really well where I need to put my efforts in teaching that child. Much better than the norm reference test does. But it's also difficult to use that test and show an improvement, an escalated improvement in the student. It's hard for us to show that. Yeah, mad minutes, we called them, Lindsay. You remember that? Mad minutes. How many can you do in a minute? Yep, they were not a lot of fun. So we use both of these, but we use them for different purposes. Now, we're going back to the norm referenced assessments here. We're going to talk about them because that's basically the ones that are mentioned in the textbook. So, and they fall into these categories. All right. The bottom one here, curriculum-based assessments, I want you to hold that one aside because that's not necessarily a norm referenced assessment. But these first four are all assessments that have specific uses, and you know, sometimes they appear in the strangest places, like objective assessments and things like that. So that's kind of why I'd like to talk with you a little bit about them tonight. Now, if you've had a chance to look at the NIC Complete Study Guide that's in your course of study, then down in Competency 8, there's a graphic organizer that has all of the assessments listed on it. And if you've not seen the NIC1 Complete Study Guide, look in Course Tips over to the right-hand side of your course of study, and you'll find it there. So what do the IQ tests do, the intelligence tests? They determine our intelligence quotient. That's IQ, intelligence quotient. Many years ago, there was a really complicated system for determining what the IQ was. But now we have a much better system in determining the intelligence of a child or a person. Now, you see that what we're looking at are some very specific areas here. Vocabulary, how well a child reasons, and how well they solve problems. So we're not really looking at content here, but instead we're looking for these things. So how does it work? Well, we have these different exams or assessments that we use. The Stanford-Binet is probably, and the Wechsler too, they are the gold standards. And they're generalizable. Now, what I mean by generalizable is that if you score 120 on the Stanford-Binet, then you'll probably score 120 on the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, the WISC-4. So they kind of, they don't really interact, but they're about the same as far as percentages. When people take one, they usually get about the same percentage on the other. Now, additionally, we have the Woodcock-Johnson tests of cognitive abilities. It's not used very much, but it is used sometimes. And then the last one, the universal nonverbal. Now, that doesn't sound very much like an IQ test, but it is. It was originally designed for people without voice, nonverbal people. But we found out about 20 years ago that it was a great assessment for English language learners. And so it's used most frequently now for English language learners. Now, I wanted to show you how this IQ thing works out because it has to do with identifying kids for intellectual disabilities. So this is the bell curve of everybody who's ever taken this exam, an IQ test, all right? Now, you see that we run from way down here on this end, this tail, all the way through to here. So 100% of the people that have taken this exam are on this bell curve. Okay, so right here, right in the center, this represents a score of 100. So 100 is the average, the mean of anybody who's ever taken a test. 100 is the score. Now, as we move left and right, we'll pick up about 68% of the folks that will score between 85 and 115. And then if we move out a little further, these are called standard deviations, by the way. Each of these splits is called a standard deviation. So we move out here, and 95% of the people who have ever taken this IQ test scored between 70 and 130. 95%. So that gives us, on this left tail, about 2.5%. And if we go way out here, we'll get down to an IQ that we cannot even measure. We can't measure an IQ of under 25. But 2.5% of the population qualifies as intellectually disabled, because we say with the IQ tests and intellectual disabled students, if they have an IQ that's more than 2 standard deviations below the norm, that's considered to be intellectually disabled. And that's right here at 69. An IQ of 69 would be more than 2 standard deviations away from the norm. We have 1 and 2. So that's how that works. Achievement tests, achievement tests are used to determine a student's ability within a particular subject. So if you think about them, these are some of the examples that we might see, and they're most typically they are norm referenced also. Now, there's a whole series of these, but I want to show you something here. Here's a great little mnemonic for you. We have the Kaufman Tests of Educational Achievement. We have the Peabody Individual Achievement Test, the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test, and the Woodcock-Johnson Tests of Achievement. Great mnemonic. If a question asks you about an achievement test, all you have to do is find something in the possible answers that has achievement in the name. Great mnemonic for remembering those or being able to pull them back. Now, each of these is developed by a different company, obviously, but they all basically do the same thing. They all look at a person's abilities within a particular subject. So we want to see how well a student does. And you remember I talked about percentiles. Well, in an achievement test, you really begin to see them. This child scores at the 75th percentile in reading. So he reads as well or better than 75% of the kids who have ever been tested. Now, adaptive behavior scales. If you remember back in identifying student needs way long time ago, we said that there were 2 parts to the definition of intellectual disabilities. One part was that we had an IQ that was more than 2 standard deviations below the norm. And the other part was that there's a significant limitation in adaptive behavior. So we have to have some sort of a scale to show where that adaptive behavior level is. Now, what is adaptive behavior? Well, as you've read this slide, you've seen, well, that's kind of like the skills of life. And that's right. That's what it is. It's the ability to live on one's own, to button your shirt, and zip your pants, and tie your shoes, and eat with utensils, and all of those things, and social skills on top of that. So that's what adaptive behavior is. And we have a series of scales, 3 of them. But again, we've got a little bit of a mnemonic here. You see, we've got the AAMR, the American Association for Mental Retardation is what AAMR stands for. We have the AAMR Adaptive Behavior Scale. We have scales of independent behavior, and we have the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scale. So you see, we can put those together. Adaptive Behavior Scale, scales of independent behavior, all kind of works together. Yeah, good mnemonic for remembering your adaptive behavior scales. Now, here's where I'm going to kind of throw a little bit of a wrench into it. We also have behavior rating scales. Now, the last bunch were called adaptive behavior scales. This bunch, this is called behavior rating. Now, here's the difference. We use these to determine whether or not a child has an emotional behavioral disorder. So what we're looking for here, as listed on the last bullet point, indications of frequency and intensity of aberrant behaviors, the kind of behaviors we don't really like students to have. And I'm sorry, I don't have a mnemonic for these 4. You're on your own for this one. I couldn't come up with one for this. You know, they all say behavior, but you know, beyond that, you're pretty much on your own. Now, look at that graphic organizer. Go to the complete study guide. Find it in your course of study and use it, because that Hummer is good. It's packed full of good stuff, including the graphic organizer that will basically do the same thing for you that I just did with these slides. And then finally, let's talk about the curriculum-based assessments. Curriculum-based assessments are used to determine how well a child is doing with the curriculum. Son of a gun, that makes sense. Now, we do it with 2 different assessments, curriculum-based assessment. The summative assessment is the one that we use at the end of a semester or a unit or whatever, you know, at the end of whatever we're doing, whatever we're teaching. We use a summative assessment. The sum of all things is the way that I remember this one. The summative assessment, we use that to see how much of that information the student retained. All right? Now, it says that they're often high stakes. If you take a look at our objective assessment at the end of NIC1, that is a summative assessment, the sum of all things. Now, the other one is a formative assessment. The formative assessment is the one we use every day in the classroom. Sometimes they're formal, sometimes they're informal. For example, if I walk up to my favorite student, Levi, and I say, hey, Levi, how much is 6 times 3? If he can answer me, I say, great, Levi, continue on. If he can't answer that, then I know that Levi is having trouble with his multiplication tables. I'm going to have to work on that. It's a formative assessment. It tells me right now what's going on with Levi as far as our math instruction goes. The Friday spelling test is a formative assessment. Lets the teacher know how much you know about the spelling words that we were supposed to get right today, but we did. So the formative assessment, we use it every single day, and it can be formal or it can be informal. And when we're thinking about curriculum-based assessments, it's not always known as that. For instance, if you go through the Iris Center Star Legacy module on assessments, you're going to find they call it curriculum-based measurement, or CBM. All right? So just understand and be aware of that. Now, with assessments, teachers can track how their students are doing. You know what? Everybody uses data for one thing or another. And we teachers can use it too to determine whether or not our students are on the plane of learning that we want them to be on. For instance, here we have a student. The whole idea here in tracking this is to make sure that the students correctly replaced words. So give him a paper back. He's written a paper for us, or a paragraph. There are some incorrectly used words or placed in the wrong place in a sentence. So we give it back and ask the student to fix it. So across the period of 32 weeks here, we're charting the student's progress. We want him to be on that red line. That would be the perfect thing, is to be just dead on that red line. But you can see this student's doing pretty good as he works his way through the semester, works his way through the school year. So tracking data tells us very quickly how a student is doing, how their educational outcomes are progressing. So works out pretty well. There's a couple of things that you need to know about English language learners and assessments. Probably the most important one is, are the assessments that we use when we think that a student should be in special education. And so when we go through that formal referral process and we begin to get ready for the assessment portion, it's important to remember that we have to test the ELL student in 2 languages. We have to test him in English and in his primary language, because it would be very, very difficult for an English language learner to pass just an English test. That'd be like me trying to take a test in Greek or in Swahili. I wouldn't be able to answer a single question in that. So the law tells us that we have to test in both English and primary language. And then if the disability shows in both languages, then the kid should go to special education. But if it only shows in one, in English, then it's just a matter of not understanding English. So that we have to make sure that we follow that law when referring English language learners for special education. So we're at the end. We've got about 7 or 8 minutes. So if you have some questions, what might they be? Shannon is typing, and looks like Christina's typing too, so hang loose with me just a minute. See what these, oh, now I have multiple folks typing, so let's see what we got. These are some long questions. So, showed a slide of assessments used for emotional behavior. Could you? Oh, sure. I'll back it up. I can do that. Now remember that all of these are listed in your graphic organizer that's in your course of study, Christina. So you'll find them all listed there too. When we are developing curriculum that meets the needs of all students, gifted in the middle and those who need extra help, what do you say to parents who feel it's unfair or that others have an advantage? Yeah, Shannon, just a minute. Jason, that would be the universal nonverbal, the one that's used most with ELL. So I'm going to stop the recording right now, but I'm going to keep on with your question here. I've got an answer for you.